Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Entrepreneur Minds Speak. I'm Lauren with Creme de Mint, a branding and packaging design agency. And today I would like to welcome Ryan Malkin, a seasoned expert in alcohol, beverage, and cannabis law. And today he'll be sharing with us valuable insights into compliance for alcohol startups.
My name is Ryan Malkin. I'm an alcohol beverage attorney. I have a practice called Malkin Law based in Miami, Florida. And quick disclaimer, all of the information in the presentation, what we're going to talk about is for educational and informational purposes only and not intended to be specific legal advice. But basically what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of an overview of a number of different areas of alcohol beverage law or the alcohol beverage regulatory landscape in the US. And then we can answer some questions and go through some other fact patterns that you guys might have. So just to make sure that we all kind of are on the same page on what we're talking about here, when you have a brand, you have to think about a number of different regulations to contend with, and depending on what the activity is. So we have the FDA, who largely regulates what the ingredients are that might go into the bottle. So all of the ingredients that would go into an alcohol beverage product would have to be generally regarded as safe by the FDA, which is why, depending on how long you've been around, you may have seen years ago with absinthe and Tujon, there was some debate over whether that was safe. Sometimes different teas could not necessarily be generally regarded as safe for specific purposes. Certainly CBD is something that's generally not generally regarded as safe for food and beverage purposes, which is why you have the issue of not having CBD or obviously THC in alcohol beverage products, which we'll get into a little bit later. And then what happens is the TTB looks to FDA for formula and labeling to make sure that whatever the products are that are being approved by TTB are generally regarded as safe. So when you have your labels and they need to be submitted, that would be through TTB and your formulas as well. They would all get submitted through your producer, your bottler, or in the case of an imported product, with your importer. Now you have your product labeled, and you'd have to get whatever licenses or permits you might need in your state and federally, which oftentimes could be an import permit or at least a federal basic wholesale permit. Now, assuming you have the product and you're ready to kind of get going, you also have to think about what the activities are and what state regulations need to be considered. So each state has its own rules that sometimes are quite different than the other, and those regulate everything from licensing to basically every trade practice and marketing activity that you can think of. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing or giving away in one state is also legal in another state. So for instance, something as as easy as like an instant rebate where you go to the register in Florida and I could get $2 off, a bottle of whatever at Publix. In New York, it's not the same thing where you can't just go to the local, wine shop and say, get me $2 off instantly. It would have to be a mail-in rebate coupon. So just those little small differences and nuances do change state to state. And so the state ABC boards govern largely what you do in each state. Then we have the FTC, and the FTC is really the one that's going to be regulating the advertising and oftentimes spokespeople, right? So if you have a spokesperson that you're paying to say great things about the product, well, the FTC is going to want disclosure so that the consumers who are reading it, know this person was paid to say this. It wasn't just because they actually like the product. So with Instagram influencers and things, you oftentimes this becoming an issue, or at least it's something to be aware of. And then finally, we have the attorneys generals, and this is probably the least worrisome generally for alcohol beverage brands. Here's where we're thinking about like coupons. I'm sorry, not coupons, but contests and sweepstakes or commercial co-ventures. So those would be oftentimes, even though there might be alcohol beverage rules around them, like for instance, the retailer can't have the prize at its premises or something. There's general rules around sweepstakes and contests in most states that basically make sure that you're actually doing it and you're not scamming people. And then similarly with oftentimes commercial co-ventures, where it's like commercial co-ventures like, hey, if you buy a bottle, we're going to donate, $2 to a charity, something like that. And each state has a little bit different rules around that. So I know that was a lot of information and a lot of regulations, but at the end of the day, you just need to think about what you're doing and kind of what bucket it goes into. and who's responsible from a regulatory perspective for that to know what rules you're trying to make sure you're complying with. Now, on the federal side, and kind of just even on the state by state basis, on the federal side, the biggest thing to worry about is what they call tied house and trade practice inducements here, where you can't give something of value. This is like the one thing where you would get into the most possible trouble of value to a retailer. And that could be basically anything that doesn't have an exception in the rules. So you could think of something as easy as like, I'm going to give you $100 for this menu placement, or it could be giving a bunch of permissible stuff for an impermissible reason by saying something like, hey, I'm going to give you all this point of sale, but only if you put us in the menu. It could be used in the same way. So the thing is that you need to make sure of, and what the idea with all of these rules is to have a level playing field, and you want to make sure that you're not inducing or giving giving a retailer something of value. And the part of it in a lot of states and federally is that they can't use that thing to then lose their independence and buy more of a competitor's product. So some states don't even get into the causes the retailer to purchase less of a competitor's product part, but just giving it is unlawful on its own. The thing that you want to make sure of is that you're basically just don't give an impermissible thing. And I know, and just being in the industry, and I'm sure a lot of people hear it as well, where you're told, oh yeah, this other account is giving, or this other brand is giving this account, hundreds of thousands of dollars for, menu placements or something like that. And they're asking us to compete or give them millions of dollars for this or that. And those things are generally impermissible. And so you just want to make sure you understand what you can do with your brand and make sure that you're falling into kind of permissible buckets. So at the end of the day, if you can take away nothing from the entire presentation, remember giving this, meaning like money or some other thing, for that, meaning display space, menu placement, back bar placement, etc., is impermissible. And so that's where you want to, if nothing else, just be mindful of that and make sure to avoid those issues. And then we talked about each state being different. So obviously every state's different, but I want to just break out like the basic buckets of the things that you can generally do from a sales and marketing perspective to help, market and sell your brand. So certainly in almost every state that I can think of, and I can't think of exceptions off the top of my head, but maybe there are, you can usually give somebody a bottle who hasn't ordered the product in the past 12 months to try it to see if they want to buy it, right? So that's pretty simple. Retailer sample. Obviously, they want to be able to play around with the product and make some drinks to see if they want to take it in. So that's generally not a problem. With consumers, there's a number of things you can do, but some of the basics are bar spends. And so like a bar spend, as an example, in like a state like New York would be buying full drinks. There's a $700 cap, plus tip. And you would be buying drinks for people at the bar, but they would be full cocktails. A tasting, on the other hand, is typically limited to quarter ounce samples. So like if you would go into a liquor store, sometimes there'll be tasting people there and give you small little, tasting samples. So tastings are different than bar spends. It's slightly different in terms of the size of the product that the person's trying, and also in terms of who gives it out, because in the tastings, it's usually the agency, and on the bar spends, it would be the bar giving it out, and you'd be paying for it as the brand. Then there's private consumer events and certainly sponsorships where you could sponsor a third party's activity. One thing to keep in mind with sponsorships, because it is an area where there could be a lot of not great, but misunderstanding, is that a brand should not be sponsoring a retailer's event. So oftentimes this comes across my desk where a brand will say, can we sponsor, whatever national account's first anniversary party or something like that. We're going to donate product to them, and we're going to give them money. And that wouldn't be okay, because first of all, you can't typically give product other than to charities for donations. And then second, you wouldn't give a retailer money for a sponsorship. That would be just giving money to a retailer, but rather a sponsorship would be something like a magazine is having its first anniversary party or website or whatever at an account if the event could be at an account. So now in this case, you're just getting advertising and marketing value at somebody else's event that happens to be at an account and they took over the account for that event. With consumers, you can always do um, specialties, hats, t-shirts, etc., registry cards, contests and sweepstakes. Um, Remember, the TTV mandatory is it would have to go on usually the about section or somewhere similar on your social media pages, and then usually at the bottom of the website. That's the thing. If you look at an ads, like if you flip through a magazine and you see an alcohol ad, you usually see like imported by whoever it might be, um, New York, New York, or whatever. There's some specific rules around TTB advertising mandatories if it's one product or more products, like part of a portfolio. But just be mindful that you do want to tell the TTB basically the point of it is to say who the responsible advertiser is. So if there's an issue, they know who to go to. And then the last bit about parts versus ounces is it's just something to be mindful of and consider. So according to the Distilled Spirits Council, one serving of alcohol or distilled spirits is 1.5 ounces of 80 proof spirit. So sometimes if you have a bunch of recipes on your website or wherever, like using like a Negroni as an example, obviously it's equal parts, 1.5 ounces oftentimes of 3 different spirits. So theoretically that would go over a serving for a person in one kind of go. So if you use parts, 1 part gin, 1 part Campari, 1 part sweet vermouth, now you're not going over the kind of reasonable consumption because you're not using ounces. So anyway, just something to consider. Now, when you're trying to promote where people should get your products, you have to think about, again, what the rules are at each state because they're different. And usually the rule is 2 or more. So that means you could say, go get our product, kind of a call to action for people at, Total Wine and Whole Foods or whatever. And that would be fine in a lot of states because you're listing 2 or more unaffiliated accounts. You couldn't say go to Casker's, Reserve Bar, and Total Wine because Casker's and Reserve Bar are not accounts, but rather just third-party marketing companies that are advertising products. So the only account you have now is Total. So that's the difference, and you just need to be mindful of like what's actually an account in a retailer, and the 2 or more rule is within each state, right? So you can't say go to I don't know, Ralph's in California and then Publix in Florida when there's not both accounts in both places. Now you've just listed one in California, one in Florida, and that doesn't work because it's 2 or more unaffiliated by state. So that's kind of how that would work. And you want to think about driving traffic to accounts this way. The other way that you can oftentimes drive traffic or drive demand and tell people about what's going on is through pre-announcement of lawful activity. So for instance, in a lot of states, you can say, hey, we're doing a tasting at such and such from 5 to 7, come by. And so that would be kind of outside the 2 or more rule because you're pre-announcing lawful activity. So you just have to think about kind of the buckets here of like, is this telling people where they can get our product to buy bottles, in which case it's typically that 2 or more rule by state, you have to check it. Or is this telling people about some event we're having that's allowed, and are you allowed to pre-announce that event in that state? I wanted to talk a little bit about DTC so everybody understands what we're talking about and think of some options for your brands. So typical DTC or direct to consumer is like a winery, right? You can go to a Napa winery, you can go to their website, they sell it to you directly, they send it to you directly, and that's kind of the end of it. Pretty straightforward. By and large, spirits can't do DTC in a meaningful way, right? Like if you're a New York brand or you're only sold in New York and you're imported into Florida and New York, you can't really sell DTC in the way that a domestic winery might be able to. So it's very limited. There was a lot of options during COVID for brands, distilleries domestically to sell, because most states allow distilleries to sell from their souvenir gift shops, but they don't always allow shipping from the gift shop to the consumer. Sometimes they have to come pick it up. That was sort of the difference during COVID in some states like New York, and then it was pulled back. So obviously different parties like American Craft Spirits Association and Discus are trying to push that forward for distilleries to be on par or have similar privileges as wine, but see how that plays out. So in the meantime, what's happening with distilled spirits is a lot of brands will use various third-party marketing companies, and it can be either like Drizzly, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, where you go to Drizzly and it basically tells you these are a few different retailers in your area that will deliver to you, or it could be a little bit more, I guess you could say, seamless, where you don't even realize that you've gone from a brand website to, let's say, a third-party marketer's website, like a Thirsty or Speakeasy Passion Spirits, etc., or a Reserve Bar, where it feels like you're on the brand website, but you're not, and you're actually ordering from a retailer. And what's happening is the third-party provider is taking that order, sending it to the retailer, much in the same way that Drizzly might, but all seamless. And then the product gets delivered or shipped, depending on the states and the rules, to you. And you felt like you were ordering from a brand potentially, but you haven't, right? You've really ordered directly from a retailer. And so it's gone through the three-tier system. It's not as though the brand sold it to you directly and permissibly, but as a consumer, unless you look at the terms and conditions or sometimes the URL changes, you may not notice it. So it makes it easy for the consumer and makes the brand feel like they're keeping the people there, because otherwise, if you go to a third party, imagine you go to Amazon, if they were allowed to sell alcohol, to go buy one product, now all of a sudden you see like a million others, and now you've bought brand B instead of brand A when you were intending to go buy brand A. So this is kind of a way to keep your consumers within your universe. So the way that this would work is normally the three-tier system is the supplier obviously sells to the wholesaler, and the wholesaler to the retailer consumer, of course. So what's happening is the supplier has a third-party provider kind of overlaying, and so then the third-party provider has retail partners that they work with. They're not partners per se, but retailers that they work with that are and they have relationships with. So what will happen is the wholesaler will sell to those directed retail partners, and then those retail partners will fulfill the orders to the consumers. I'm just shift a little bit into some marketing stuff. The idea is that you don't want to have any curative or therapeutic claims. You don't want to suggest perhaps that drinking alcohol is better than having fruit. You don't want to suggest overconsumption. You don't want to use degrading images, things like that. One thing I wanted to talk about briefly was, it's not part of my law firm, it's a separate company, but I founded an app that helps people understand all of the trade practice and marketing rules in all 50 states. So what you can and cannot do in the states with regards to displays and tastings of bar spends, and what you can say on social media, all of those different things. So if anybody's interested, you can go to setthebarapp.com. THC, which I'm sure everybody knows, is the psychoactive ingredient in cannabis. Cannabidiol, or CBD, is one of the multiple cannabinoids in the cannabis plant, both from the cannabis sativa L plant, and that obviously is the one that doesn't have any psychoactive properties, but sometimes people say has other health benefits. The issue that we have here with CBD in terms of alcohol is that CBD was approved in Epidiolex, and the issue is that what is a drug? And so now we have a ingredient that was approved as a drug, now intending to be used in a food. And so that ends up being what the issue is, and largely the case here, where you cannot have a drug in a food product. So we have hemp-derived food ingredients that are generally regarded safe, because you'll see hemp seed oils at Whole Foods and whatnot, and hemp seeds for protein and things. But that is different than the cannabinoid, because the cannabinoid, you can have full spectrum hemp seed oil, which has multiple cannabinoids. But when you start isolating CBD separately, then you start getting into a little bit of a different area. And so the TTB's policy around all of this, anyhow, that's what we're talking about today in terms of the alcohol beverage side of it, is that you can have a product with hemp. It just has to have basically hemp seeds or hemp seed oil, and not specifically say it has CBD in it. because you can't say that under FDA rules. So it's really FDA telling TTB what to do here. But there are products that have hemp in it, but you would not call out CBD. And then you're not supposed to put anything that suggests cannabis use or psychoactive effects on the product, because then you're suggesting something that's not there and being misleading. So that's the intent behind the product, the policy is that you're trying to adhere to what FDA's guidance is, which is that you cannot have CBD in a product and you cannot make a health claim regarding CBD, because now you're saying treading on the area of a drug. That's why you'll see sometimes warning letters where if it says CBD is great for, anxiety or something like that, now you're basically making a claim that, this is going to help you for that. But if you just said full spectrum hemp seed oil and people know that that is supposed to help them with whatever ailment, then that's different than making the claim that it's going to actually do something to you, like a drug bite or a new dietary supplement or something like that. If you're going to start a winery or distillery or any other production facility, there's a couple of different steps that you would have to take. So, first of all, you need a federal license for producing wine in this particular case, and you would need a location. You would need to have diagrams of that location, and you'll need to know what the floors are made of, the walls are made of, everything, and sort of outline your production method. Certainly, you would have to outline with whoever your experts are yourself how you actually make the wine in terms of what you do with the grapes, etc. But from a licensing perspective, you would go on your state website, pull the applications. So you need to get a federal license and a state license that are applicable to whatever you're doing. And usually you will need a lease, obviously the right to the premises, and you outline all of the owners and the corporate information. It's usually quite in depth and often requires fingerprinting. So that's kind of the step by step. You form a company, you would typically get the trademarks, you would go to your state website and pull the information for whatever app licenses you want, and then obviously go forward with the federal one. I typically would suggest, whether it's an attorney or a consultant or something like that, that is familiar with their state, because sometimes there's different zoning restrictions and you don't want to get into a lease and start getting down the road of a property, because you do have to sign the lease before you actually, get going with licensing. So you don't want to sign a lease and move forward with the build out, then find down the road that you actually couldn't have whatever you wanted there for zoning reasons. Farmers market sales, like, in New York and some other states, you are allowed to sell at farmers markets. So that's a state by state thing. Events and licensing, again, it's state by state. Like New York has a marketing permit that allows you to do tastings and sell by the bottle under the marketing permit if you have a number of different underlying permits. I mean, it's a little bit of a assembly line flow, I would say. And I would definitely start at your state website, but I also find that TTB has a lot of great presentations about the licensing process as well. And certainly you can reach out to me and we're happy to provide some information and point you in the right direction too. If you're going to be importing or creating a brand, assuming you're not the winery, but going to wineries and asking them to make your wine for you, like co-packing, and if you wanted to be the importer yourself in the US, that would be fine, or you can find an importer. There's a number of different service providers. There's, like Park Street and MHW and things like that who kind of do this for you, right? So, as an example, if you didn't want to do a lot of the work on the back end, you could work with a third party like the Park Street or something, and they would be the importer for you. They would get the colas for you. And then they have licenses in a number of different states like New York, New Jersey, Florida, California, etc. And the other similar companies have licenses in a lot of the same states, and they could also distribute the product as well. You would need to have a contract with the producer that says, here's what I want to get, here's the price that I'm paying, here's the quality, you're not going to change it without my permission, like this is what I want. You're going to put these labels on it that I provide to you. You're going to, stage it and have it ready for pickup. And then if you're importing yourself or using a third party importer, then the importer would get the labels, bring it to the US, and then it would have to go through the 3-tier system. So you'd have to get a distributor in whatever states you're in, to retailer and then consumer. From the legal side, what you need to think about when you're talking to different co-packers as possible, contract partners for you, is a few things. You want to know what their capacity is, of course, if you scale up, but you also want to know what their minimums are. You also want to know kind of what's the flow. How soon can you get the bulk product there? how soon can you get your other ingredients if you're going to be ordering them there? How soon can you get like your glass and all those sort of things? Because maybe it can only be a week prior. Then where do you have them if um, you know you have them 6 months ahead? How long are they going to warehouse it after for you? And then what are the terms in terms of the pricing in terms of sale as it scale up over time? What happens, and this is a big one that's been coming up lately, especially with RTDs, who's responsible for what? So if it's a canned product, let's say, and you ordered the cans to the distillery, but they were all wrong, but the distillery filled them, and now you have a bunch of cans that are filled that are leaking or whatever. Is it your fault because the cans came and they didn't and you ordered them? Was it the distillery's fault because they didn't check the cans, or what? And so this ends up coming into a dispute of like who's responsible for what. So my suggestion is to think through what are all of the worst case scenarios that are going to happen. Hopefully none of them do, but who's responsible for what at the end of the day for all of these different things? Because if they do happen, you don't want to be out hundreds of thousands of dollars and like, sorry, buddy, we filled the cans for you. The juice was fine. You ordered crappy cans. And it's like, all right, well, like you were supposed to check them. Were they? Like, I don't know. And so that's kind of some of the things to think about on the co-packing side, just when you're trying to figure out partners, is just work through some of those scenarios.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I think I'm going to have people start jumping in and asking their questions, but I did want to ask one. What is required to be on bottle labels? I know that you hadn't really covered that in this presentation, so I was wondering if you could take a few minutes to talk about that.
Yeah, great question. Okay, so obviously different products are different, but by and large, you're going to have your brand name. You're going to have the alcohol by volume. You're going to have the net contents. You're going to have the class and type or statement of composition, depending on what the product is. So, that could be vodka, that could be gin, that could be whiskey, that could be, you know, whiskey with natural flavors or, whatever. You're going to have the government statement, which has to be in a very specific format. You can Google, obviously, TTB and label mandatories. There's the TT Beverage Alcohol Manual, the BAM. It's a little bit out of date, but it'll definitely give you, steer in the right direction of what all the requirements are. And then you'd have to have a bottle by or import statement. So obviously, if it's an import product, it would be imported by blank, New York, New York, or whatever the city and state might be. If it is a domestic product, then it would be bottle by, or there's a few different ways that you can say it's still in bottle by, or whatever. There's a number of options depending on what it is, and then also city and state. So you know those are, I would say, the basics, plus also the really the romance copy that you might want. Um, but the TTB has some like really, really good basic outlines on all this stuff. And so I would definitely encourage you to reach out if you want to shoot me an email. I'll pop my email into the chat. I'm not sure if everybody can, yeah, everybody can read. And I can send you some of those links if you want to send me a note. But those would be the basics. The only thing I would also mention is that for some products like distilled spirit specialty products, and there's a which is basically a product that doesn't fit into an exact category, like you know um, vodka with natural flavors, or vodka with you know coconut and this and that and the other, not just a straight vodka. There's a formula approval process, and so you need to just understand, which is what also you can go to the TTV website and check out what products require formula approval, and they have kind of a generator, and you can type in like domestic product and what it is, and it will tell you if formula approval is required. And that has to happen before you get the label approval, because labeling, it looks to formula and say, okay, this particular formula approval number says vodka with whatever, orange and this and that. And so now we know that this label has to say vodka with orange and this and that. And that part of it's approved. And then the rest of it we look at from the labeling side. So just remember there could be formula approval and label approval for your product, depending on what it is.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. There's another question here about licensing for in-home wine tastings.
Typically, tastings have to occur at a licensed premises. So if the brand's doing something off of the licensed premises, then you have to consider, is this a branded event? And then does it have to be catered? Is it okay to not have any licenses at all? So it ends up being a little bit of a state by state question. If you want to make it a formal event, I think you have to think it through the actual formal event processes and consider what the rules are in your particular state. And something may or may not be required.
Is there anyone that would like to unmute themselves to ask their questions? I know there were a few more in the chat.
Hey Ryan, thanks so much for speaking with us today. I was just curious if I wanted to start an online kind of like e-commerce shop for spirit brands, can I sell direct to consumer across states?
So the way that it works for sales is that it's typically the retailer, like we said, who's making the sale. So by and large, in Avalera, I think there's Sovos and a few other people have this research too, and you can find it, or I can try to direct you some more information. But by and large, retailers cannot ship across state lines, but for some limited exceptions. So the retailer in one state, if you were having your online shop, you couldn't, unless you're a retailer in that state, ship to consumers across state lines without being allowed to in that other state. But what you oftentimes see is that if you're starting a quote online shop, instead of actually being a retailer at all, you would be a third party marketing company. And so what you would do is you would have the homepage, like the Amazon landing page or whatever. The people come to your, Amazon for lack of a better word, and then they want to order this new brand. And then at that point, you actually direct the order to a retailer that can ship it to the person in the zip code that the person lives. And then the retailer actually processes the order. And oftentimes, what happens is the retailer will give you a small percentage um, for basically marketing them to the consumer. So, I don't know, 5% or $5 or, depending on the price, so something nominal. And so that's kind of, or there might be another monetary way for you to kind of make the business work, but that's kind of how it works. So you might not be a retailer at all, and you might not be selling anything at all. And you just might be kind of marketing all of these different things for people and being a platform. Um, does that answer your first question?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And could that happen kind of in the back end? Like, I'm not trying to start my own brand, but I want to make it easier for other people to discover cool and interesting new spirit brands.
Right. So I think that you could actually just be a marketing company, and then you could potentially work with a couple different technology companies or do the tech side yourself. And yeah, and you can totally think through some ways where you would be able to be the place where people know to go to find cool new stuff. But then when they actually hit order, it actually goes to the three-tier system, and you don't have to deal with the actual being licensed at all, which obviously you doesn't sound like you want to do. You could be, of
Correct.
course, but it doesn't sound like that's what you want to do. Um, and so that's kind of the direction I would probably think to go. And then you would have, obviously your terms and conditions and stuff on your side, and then you'd have a relationship with different retailers to say, when the person orders in, 10003, I want you to take that order and deliver it, and they'll buy the product from the wholesalers and stuff.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah, go
Oh,
ahead.
great. I'm a small farmer. I'm not a trader, and I do produce my own wine. And my simple question is, what kind of paper should I possess in my pocket to approach a restaurant owner or restaurant manager to be self-confident and protected that I am offering this my wine legally to sell to consumer directly at their facilities under brand homemade wine in New York?
I'm not sure of the homemade rules, to be honest with you. I don't work with any individuals who make wine at home. We only work with people who are producing at licensed facilities. So I actually don't know that one off the top of my head. The SLA is typically pretty helpful, especially over, I would say, email. Just so you have it in kind of, make sure you guys are on the same page. But I don't know the answer off the top of my head, unfortunately, in terms of selling homemade wine.
Hi, Ryan. My name is Ariana. I've actually
Hey.
worked with you in the past, so thanks for taking the time today. I just have a question about influencer gifting and partnerships and kind of the legality. Let's say I were, in LA or Miami or New York or, a big city that, a lot of influencers have followers in, can I gift product to them? Obviously there's no exchange of money, let's say at that point. I'm just kind of curious about what people are doing in that realm.
I think it's a good question, and typically I would see it as if you had the product gifted and delivered through the three-tier system to somebody individually, then perhaps depending on the state, I think it could probably work. I would say you should look at the state rules because there's not really like a specific authorization. It- It's a little bit outside the rules of the regulations because the regulations typically say, can you give consumer samples? And obviously you can, but this is giving a gift. People give gifts to media all the time because they're asking them to consider it for purposes of review, and that's been happening obviously for hundreds of years. So I kind of see the influencers in sort of the same way as media. They have millions of followers, and you're asking them to consider your product for review. And so as long as it's traveling through the three-tier system and taxes are paid, I think that the regulators would have a hard time saying this was an impermissible thing to do because it was tax paid and you gave it to this particular person the same way you might give it to any media. And nobody's ever, that I'm aware of, said don't give it to the New York Times anymore, whatever.
And when you say taxes paid, you mean I would, let's say if I obviously didn't want them to pay for anything, I would pay for it myself?
Yeah, like you would just have it delivered from Drizzly or wherever from the liquor store. So that it was a depletion from a liquor store. So it's not like the state's missing out on any taxes because
Right.
it traveled through the normal channels. The issue sometimes ends up being, if a distillery pulled it and can you pull samples without it being tax paid? And then the answer is a little bit different because now, it was bonded product and where did it go? And did it go to the wholesaler and the wholesaler lost the revenue? And, there may be options in different states, but generally speaking, if you're trying to be as straightforward as possible, pulling it from a retailer would be, I think, the most straightforward. But certainly we can talk offline about other options if they're more particular to your situation.
Awesome. Thank you.
All
Cool.
right, Ryan, thank you so much. This was very informative.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.